Dr. Emily Winters wasn't supposed to be in this position. A young scientist on the cusp of a groundbreaking discovery, she had made a name for herself with her research into quantum viruses, a strange, experimental project that straddled the line between biology and quantum mechanics. What she hadn't accounted for, though, was how dangerously close to the edge her work was and how quickly it could all go sideways. She adjusted her glasses, staring at the glowing monitor in front of her, surrounded by beeping machinery and the faint hum of the lab's quantum computer. The lab was pristine, sterile, almost, but it had the feel of something too big, too important for its own good. Emily loved it here. The sterile white walls, the sharp smell of fresh coffee from the break room, the sound of the ever-present hum of the quantum computers. It was a place of precision, a place where reality itself could be bent and reshaped. But today, something felt off. Her assistant, Jace, hovered by the door, scrolling through his phone as if he didn't have a care in the world. The guy was younger than Emily by a few years, but in a different universe entirely. He was the kind of person who laughed at the worst possible moments, mostly because he had no idea how dangerous things were getting. Emily tried to ignore him, focusing instead on the data running in front of her. The quantum virus they'd been working on had shown huge potential. It was supposed to alter human consciousness by tapping into the quantum realm, allowing the mind to temporarily leave its physical body and explore other dimensions of time and space, but the last batch had come back wrong. The virus was spreading faster than they could contain it. And worse yet, it was doing things. Emily, Jace interrupted, leaning against the doorway with his usual smirk, I think I figured out what's wrong with the data. Emily's gaze flickered up to him for a brief second before returning to the screen. She rubbed her eyes. Jace, not now. This is important. You're not gonna believe what I'm seeing here. She pointed at the screen, showing the cluster of data points rapidly growing out of control. The virus it's jumping between time loops. The consciousness of the infected isn't just shifting between realities. It's rewriting them. He raised an eyebrow, clearly not following. Right. So it's like one of those time travel movies, where you have to be careful not to mess up anything or you end up destroying the space-time continuum? Emily snorted despite herself. If only it were that simple. The virus isn't just affecting the body or the brain. It's warping everything around the person. Time, space, reality itself. She typed rapidly, her mind racing to catch up with what she was seeing. This wasn't just an anomaly, it was something completely new. She leaned closer, fingers hovering above the keyboard, when a sudden, sharp jolt made her flinch. Before she could register what had happened, she felt dizzy. The lights overhead flickered and buzzed, like something had short-circuited. Then came the sickening sense of weightlessness, like she was falling backward. In the space of a heartbeat, the laboratory around her disappeared, everything went black. When she opened her eyes, she was no longer in her lab. Instead, she found herself in the middle of a grand ballroom, lit by the warm glow of chandeliers. Music floated through the air, mingling with the soft chatter of elegantly dressed people. Her heart raced. She blinked, trying to make sense of the situation, but it didn't help. She was standing in the middle of a crowd, wearing an absurdly long gown that swirled around her legs. What the hell? Her mind screamed. Was she dreaming? This had to be a dream. She tried to calm herself, looking around at the unfamiliar faces. But everyone in the room seemed so normal. They moved with a practiced elegance, offering her polite smiles as they sipped their wine and exchanged pleasantries. The conversation around her sounded a little like gibberish. Words in foreign accents. Yet, somehow, she understood every single one of them. Emily's eyes darted toward the corner of the room, where a figure, an old man with an odd twinkle in his eye, was watching her. Something about his gaze made her skin crawl, like he knew something she didn't. Ah, Dr. Winters, it is so nice to see you again, the old man said, walking up to her with an air of familiarity. His voice was warm, yet there was an unsettling quality to it. She hadn't noticed him approach, but there he was, standing before her as if he'd been expecting her. "Excuse me, do we know each other?" she asked, trying to sound as calm as possible despite the chaos swirling in her brain. Her voice felt off, too a little higher, maybe. The old man smiled cryptically. "Ah, yes, in time you will understand. The answers lie not in the present, but in the future and the past, and every place in between." He tapped her arm lightly, as if reassuring her, and then turned away. "But be careful, Dr. Winters. Time is no longer your ally." Emily opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, the ground beneath her seemed to shift. The floor swayed like she was on a boat, and the music around her warped and distorted, the notes turning into something strange and alien. A vertigo-like sensation struck her as everything around her spun out of focus, and then she was back in her lab, her breath caught in her throat. She looked around, disoriented. The white walls, the hum of the computers, everything was exactly as it had been. But it felt wrong. Too still. Too quiet. Her watch blinked just a flicker, a warning. The seconds ticked by, but something wasn't right. She checked the time. 2 hours had passed. No, it couldn't be. She had only been gone for a moment. She stumbled toward the screen, hands shaking. Jace was sitting at his desk, unaware of the turmoil around him, typing something into his own computer. He hadn't even noticed her disappearance. The data was still running. But it had changed, become more erratic, like it was now moving on its own. Emily felt a cold knot form in her stomach. She turned to Jace, but when she opened her mouth to speak, he didn't respond. Instead, he turned slowly toward her, a blank expression on his face. "Jace?" she asked, but the words barely left her lips before he blinked, and in that split second, something else flickered in his eyes, something far too old and knowing. "You shouldn't be here, Emily," he said, his voice oddly detached. Her heart pounded. This wasn't right. None of it was, but before she could question him further, a wave of dizziness overcame her again. The lights flickered once more, and Emily felt herself falling, pulled toward the darkness at the edge of her consciousness, and then, just as before, she was gone. The world around Emily rippled and shifted again, like a fabric being pulled by invisible hands. There was no steady ground beneath her feet, no point of reference. One moment she was in the lab, and the next just as abruptly as before she found herself in a different place. The air smelled faintly of salt water, and when she opened her eyes, she saw a vast, open ocean stretching out toward the horizon. A rickety wooden ship swayed gently beneath her feet, its sails billowing in the wind. The sound of seagulls cut through the air, and the creak of the ship's timbers was oddly soothing. But this wasn't a place she recognized. The ship, though old, was oddly detailed, as if it belonged to a time centuries ago. People crowded around the deck, sailors, traders, and a few women dressed in long skirts. They moved about, speaking in a language that she could understand, but it wasn't English. The words felt distorted, like they were being spoken underwater. She could pick out fragments, but nothing fully made sense. Emily's heartbeat quickened, and she reached out to steady herself against the ship's wooden railing. The wind tugged at her hair, and the sun burned brightly overhead. She glanced down and was startled to find herself in a long, billowing gown again. Her fingers traced the fabric, the strange sensation of being out of her own body momentarily grounding her. But this reality felt just as foreign as the last. She wasn't just out of her lab, she was out of time. The ship crested a wave and the world shimmered again, distorting the scene before her eyes. The people around her blurred, their faces becoming fuzzy like watercolor paintings running in the rain. The vibrant blue of the sky melted into a dull gray, and Emily felt her stomach drop. Suddenly, a voice broke through the chaos, a familiar voice, but one that shouldn't have been here. "Emily, you've got to stop running from it." She turned, nearly tripping on her gown, and found herself face to face with Dr. Ava Klein. But this wasn't the Ava she knew. This version of her was older. Her once straight hair was now tangled and wild, her clothes torn and worn from years of travel. Her expression was dark, worried. "What's going on?" Emily gasped, grabbing her by the arm. "Where are we? This isn't real." Ava gave a hollow laugh and shook her head, pulling away from Emily's grip. She walked toward the edge of the ship and stared into the horizon. "Isn't it real? Or is it more real than you'd like to admit?" Emily blinked, trying to follow her logic, but her head was spinning. "No, it's not real. This isn't real." Her voice cracked as panic set in. She didn't know where she was anymore, or how to control this whatever this was. "You're not here, Emily," Ava said quietly, not turning to look at her. "You're trapped between spaces. Between times. Your mind is being pulled apart, stretched thin across all these fractured realities." Her voice was calm now, almost too calm. "You can't fix it, not alone. It's too late for that." Emily's chest tightened. "But the virus, it's supposed to be the key to controlling consciousness. To fixing the time anomaly." Her voice faltered, the words sounding hollow even as she said them. "I thought I was supposed to be fixing it, not breaking it." Ava sighed deeply. "You think you're the one in control, don't you? But you're not. Not anymore. Time and space, they don't play by the same rules anymore." She turned her head toward Emily, her face shadowed. "If you don't wake up from this, there won't be a real world left to return to." The words hit Emily like a cold wave. She stepped backward, heart racing, but the ship's deck wavered beneath her again. She blinked, feeling her vision blur. The voices around her rose in a sudden cacophony, the sailors yelling orders in languages she couldn't understand. The ship lurched violently, the wood groaning beneath her feet as a storm rolled in from nowhere, the waves towering like mountains. She couldn't keep her balance. The ship seemed to stretch impossibly long, twisting out of shape. The sunlight burned her eyes, turning everything a blinding white. She closed her eyes, trying to block it out, but the deck disappeared. Emily gasped, her breath coming in sharp, shallow bursts, and the world around her went dark. For a long moment, there was nothing but a crushing weight of silence, and then she opened her eyes. She was back in the lab. Again, her hands were shaking as she wiped her face, feeling the lingering sensation of the storm's wetness on her skin. The sterile, metallic scent of the lab filled her nostrils. The fluorescent lights flickered overhead, but something was different. This time, the hum of the quantum computers was distorted, sounding more like an eerie drone. The air felt thick with the weight of something unseen. Emily's heart skipped a beat as she looked around the room. Everything seemed normal, yet it wasn't. Jace was still sitting at his desk, typing away on his computer, as if nothing had happened. The only sound in the room was the click of keys. She looked at him, but there was something wrong about his posture. It was almost as if he had been frozen in place, waiting for her to return. He didn't even look up when she walked toward him. "Jace," she called, her voice trembling. "Are you hearing this?" He didn't respond. Not immediately. Then, just as before, his head turned slowly toward her, but his eyes were different. His pupils were unnaturally wide, and there was no recognition in them, just a deep, eerie stillness. "You're still here," he said, his voice mechanical. "But you shouldn't be." Emily felt a rush of cold crawl up her spine. The world was pressing in on her, too real and too strange all at once. She glanced back at the monitors, but the data on the screens was no longer readable. It was gibberish, strings of numbers and symbols that flickered and shifted like they had a life of their own. And then, for the first time, Emily saw something that chilled her to the bone. A small window on one of the monitors was displaying an image of herself. But this wasn't the Emily that had entered the lab. This version of her was older, worn, her face drawn and tired, her hair streaked with gray. The image flickered, like a static-filled video playing in reverse, and Emily could see, just for a brief moment, her older self staring back at her with wide, terrified eyes. Her heart raced. That's not possible. The virus, the quantum anomaly, it wasn't supposed to allow for this. She turned toward Jace, but he was already gone. His chair was empty, the computer screen flickering in his place. Her stomach twisted. "I have to fix this," Emily muttered to herself. Though the words felt meaningless, she staggered back toward the lab's door, but before she could reach it, the lights flickered again. This time, they didn't come back on. Emily stood still, holding her breath. There was a strange noise in the darkness, like the sound of distant laughter. It was faint at first, but it grew louder, almost deafening. A cacophony of voices, all speaking at once, all distorted. She covered her ears, but the sound only got louder. The air around her shimmered, and she felt that familiar pull again, like she was being sucked into another world. "Emily," a voice called out, her own voice, but warped, distorted. "You should have listened." The darkness consumed her. The darkness enveloped her once more, cold and suffocating, like being buried beneath layers of shifting sand. Emily's breath caught in her throat, and for a moment, she couldn't move, couldn't see. The very fabric of reality seemed to have unraveled, and she was floating in an endless void, suspended between moments, between lives, between versions of herself that she could barely comprehend. Then, just as quickly as it had taken her, the void spat her out again, thrusting her back into a new place, a new version of her fractured reality. She stumbled, finding herself standing on a rooftop. The air was thick with fog, the skyline of a city barely visible in the distance. The ground beneath her felt unsteady, as though the building was swaying. Looking down, she realized she wasn't alone. There were people, strangers dressed in strange clothes, their faces obscured by masks. They stood motionless, as if frozen, staring out into the fog as if they were waiting for something. Waiting for someone. Emily tried to speak, but her voice didn't seem to carry in this world. She raised her hand to her throat, wondering if she had somehow lost her ability to speak, but the moment she touched her skin, she felt something cold and unfamiliar, something wrapped around her wrist. She looked down and saw that her arm was shackled to a heavy, rusted chain that led to a tall, iron structure in the center of the rooftop. Her pulse quickened, the weight of the chain pulling her back toward the center of this strange world. Panic surged in her chest. She yanked at the chain, her fingers slipping as she tried to free herself. The fog around her thickened, swirling in unnatural patterns, and the voices of the masked people began to echo in her ears, their murmurs too soft to understand, but their tone was unmistakably ominous. "Wake up," a voice called from behind her. It wasn't Jace's. It wasn't Ava's. It was just a voice, a deep, unearthly whisper. It felt like it was inside her head. "Wake up, Emily." She spun around, expecting to find the source of the voice, but there was no one there. Only the fog and the eerie stillness of the rooftop. "Who are you?" she cried out, her voice shaky. The masked figures slowly turned their heads toward her, their faces expressionless behind their masks. But their eyes were different. Empty. Hollow. Like they were staring into a void. And then, one of them spoke. "You are not real." The words sent a jolt through her, like an electric shock. She stumbled backward, her heart pounding in her chest. Not real? She wasn't real? She didn't know how to process the statement. This wasn't possible. She was real. She had to be. "Wake up, Emily. The dream is slipping." The words didn't make sense. She looked down at her wrist again, at the chain. Her breath caught in her throat as she realized that the chain had begun to rust. It was decaying before her eyes, crumbling into dust, but the shackles around her wrist remained, unmoving, unbreakable. The fog swirled, growing darker. The figures around her were no longer still. They were moving now, but they weren't walking. They were gliding, drifting toward her. Their movements were too smooth, too deliberate, like they were being controlled by something unseen. "You need to wake up," the voice whispered again, closer this time. The tone was not a suggestion, but an order. "Wake up." The words resonated in her mind, echoing with a strange familiarity. The dream was slipping. Was she dreaming? Was this even real? Her chest tightened, a feeling of dread creeping over her. She wasn't sure what was real anymore, what time it was, what world she was in. She was losing track, her mind spinning in circles. The more she tried to hold on, the more everything slipped through her fingers. "No," she whispered, almost pleading with the empty air. "No, I won't let go." She reached out again, gripping the chain, but the world around her dissolved into smoke, the fog swirling violently until it consumed everything. The next moment, Emily was standing in a forest. The air was thick and heavy, and the trees loomed tall, their branches tangled together in a web of gnarled limbs. It was silent, too silent, as though all sound had been muffled by some invisible force. She looked around, but there were no signs of life. Not a single bird, not even a breeze. The ground beneath her feet felt soft, almost like moss, and as she walked, the earth seemed to shift, the terrain changing with each step. The forest was not a normal forest, it was alive, its every detail shifting and changing like the fabric of a dream that was not quite stable. Emily took a deep breath, trying to calm her racing mind. Her surroundings seemed to pulse, vibrating with an energy she couldn't quite place. It was as though the very land itself was aware of her presence. It was watching her, waiting for her to make the next move. She glanced down at her wrist again, the shackles still there, the chain now gone entirely, leaving nothing but the memory of it. She tried to move forward, but a shadow flickered in the corner of her vision. She spun around, her heart racing, but no one was there. "Emily." The voice again. So close, it felt as if it was inside her very thoughts. She turned in the direction of the voice, her eyes scanning the trees. There was no one there, but the air seemed to hum with a strange energy, like the forest itself was alive and aware of her presence. And then, she saw it. A figure emerged from the trees, a tall, slender figure, cloaked in black. The figure was not human. It was something more. Its face was obscured by a shadow, but Emily could feel its eyes on her, cold and penetrating. "You are the key." The words weren't spoken, they were felt, vibrating in her chest, like a deep resonance that she couldn't escape. She didn't know what they meant, but she knew they were important. She had to understand. I don't understand," Emily stammered, stepping back. "What do you mean? What key?" The figure didn't move, didn't speak again, but the energy around her shifted. The trees began to bend, their branches twisting and reaching for her, as if they wanted to pull her into the earth itself. Her heart pounded in her chest as she fought to move, but the ground beneath her feet had grown sticky, like quicksand. Her legs grew heavy, like she was sinking into the very forest. "You have to wake up," the figure said, its voice an echo in her mind. "Before it's too late." Before what was too late? Emily's mind raced, but the words felt like they were slipping away from her, too distant, too unreachable. She didn't know if she was losing her grip on reality or if reality had already lost its grip on her. Time was no longer linear, and she didn't know how much longer she could keep going like this. With a final, desperate effort, she wrenched herself free from the grasping forest and began to run. The trees blurred around her, the world spinning faster and faster. The ground beneath her feet buckled and shifted, and the shadows of the forest seemed to twist, becoming something darker, something more sinister. And then she woke up, but this time, she wasn't in the lab. She wasn't anywhere she recognized. She was standing in front of a tall, dark mirror. And staring back at her was a version of herself she had never seen before.